Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you very much for joining us for another live stream. I am going to be joined momentarily by the amazing Thaddeus of Reasoned Answers, a brother to whom I have great respect, both as a scholar and as a tactician. I think he'd make a great chess opponent. And tonight we're going to be looking at the horrific, stark development of racism within the Islamic sources, which a lot of Muslims of color, particularly black Muslims, kind of been sold a dodgy car. Basically, they've been bounced into Islam by the allegation that Christianity is a white man's racist religion. And the best example historically that we can give of that is the fantastic, amazing boxer Muhammad Ali, who was originally named after Cassius Clay, who was someone who was an abolitionist, a Christian against the slave trade, Cassius Clay, who then, because he got told that Islam is, a black man's religion and Christianity is a white man's religion that's full of racists, took on the name of two slave traders, Muhammad Ali. And we're going to see actually the veins of racism run right through the Islamic sources. So if you're a black Muslim, you will want to stay tuned. Thaddeus, how are you doing?
Hello.
Good to have you back
on here. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure to have you on, my friend. Always a pleasure to have you on. I thoroughly enjoyed your last presentation, and I have no doubt at all that this one is going to be just as good. Do you want to just give a brief synopsis before we pray about what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I think you put it well, that we get this narrative that Christianity is the white man's religion. Therefore, Islam is the religion for everyone else. So if you're not white, you should be converting to Islam. Unfortunately, when we look at the Islamic sources, we see that racism was quite prevalent among the early Muslims. There may have been an occasional person here or there that wasn't racist, but by and large, it was a religion created to emphasize the Arab superiority and to justify the Arab conquest of the rest of the world. So when you say people who are different than you are inferior, kind of gives you an implicit justification to take over their lands, enslave them, mistreat them. And we see that's exactly what happened in Islam. Nearly a millennia before Europeans got involved with the African slave trade, Islam was bringing millions of Africans out of Africa and enslaving them in Muslim lands.
Okay, so it's going to be quite a topic, and quite counter the Dawagandist Dawaganda. So on that note, do you want to start us with a prayer, please?
Yeah, I'm going to read Psalm 117, which is only 2 lines, and then continue into Psalm 118. I chose this psalm because it gives the contrast between what we're going to see in the Islamic sources and what Christianity properly teaches, what the entire Bible properly teaches, which is that all human beings are created in the image of God and are of equal value, and God's message is for everyone.
Okay.
So starting with Psalm 117. Praise the Lord, all nations. Extol him, all peoples. For great is his steadfast love towards us, and the faithfulness of the Lord endures forever. Praise the Lord. Psalm 118. O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his steadfast love endures forever. Out of my distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me? The Lord is on my side as my helper. I shall look in triumph on those who hate me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than trust in princes. All nations surround me. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. They surround me on every side. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. They surrounded me like bees. They went out like a fire among thorns. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. I was pushed hard, so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. Glad songs of salvation are in the tents of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. The right hand of the Lord exalts. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. I shall not die, but I shall live, and recount the deeds of the Lord. The Lord has disciplined me severely, but he has not given me over to death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them, and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it. I thank you that you have answered me and become my salvation. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Save us, we pray, O Lord. O Lord, we pray, give us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We bless you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is God, and he has made his light to shine upon us. Bind the festal sacrifice with cords. Up to the horns the altar. You are my God, and I will give thanks to you. You are my God, I will extol you. O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his steadfast love endures forever.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, Thaddeus, I'll bring up the screen that you want to share. If you want to take it in, and just like last time, what I'll do is I'll chip in and ask questions and prod and poke, and if I feel I need to, I'll push you on.
Yep.
And yeah, we'll see how we get on. Go on.
Alrighty, so we already gave a little introduction, so I'll just dive right in. We're going to be talking about race today, but we kind of first need to establish what we mean by race. So what do we mean by ethnicity? What do we mean by race? And what is the difference between the two terms? We kind of all have an idea of what race means. It's not like a foreign, odd term to us. But at the same time, it's kind of hard to precisely define. So I'm going to ask you your thoughts first, Bob.
What do I think in the distinction between race and ethnicity?
Yes.
Yeah, I understand ethnicity to mean a group that shares a common genetic makeup as well as a common language and a common culture. And race, I believe to be a very modern term which refers purely to one's color of skin and not necessarily speaking to anything else.
Yeah, I think that that's more or less correct. The way I've defined it here is that ethnicity is a social group with a shared, distinct cultural or national identity. So, people who live together, think alike, not like there's one uniform thought of everyone, but, that they share a lot in common. Whereas race is kind of the suggestion that whatever differences we observe in culture and the way people think about the world, these are related to biological traits, primarily skin color. So there raises the suggestion that there are real differences between people that go beyond different cultures or different backgrounds, that there's something inherent to the person's DNA that makes them the way they are. So now that we've defined it, we have to ask, is race real? And I'm going to suggest that it's both real and not real. But before I give my reasons why, what do you think about this question, Bob? Is race something real, or is it something we as human beings have invented?
To be honest, I err on the side of it being a bit of a fiction. I believe in ethnos. I believe that there are nations and tribes and tongues, but I think race is a completely modern Enlightenment concept that the Western European man decided to categorize the rest of the world into. And it's not a biblical category. So I tend to go, I tend to go not a real thing, but it is a social construct by which people understand the world. So.
Yeah, and my thoughts are very similar. I kind of view this the same way that I view the Bible's description of the foreign gods. They're not real in that they don't have any physical existence. They don't have any objective material nature. There's not something inherent about human beings that makes one human being different from another. So in that sense, it's not real. We're all created in the image of God. We all have equal status before him. But it is real in the sense that there are these ethnic and cultural differences which correlate to what we perceive as human race. And this is because of our own choices, both our voluntary choices, who we choose to associate, and our involuntary choices, the past sins of humanity segregating the world into different, into these divides where we now view the world in these racial terms that people in the past wouldn't have necessarily done. Because of our sin and the fact that we think in these terms, it kind of creates this self-fulfilling race-based society where we think it's real, so it becomes real, which is exactly how the Bible treats the foreign gods, because people are devoting so much attention to them, because they're living their lives around them. They are treated as real, even though they don't exist in physical reality. So they're both real and unreal at the same time. And I view race kind of the same way. So, as we kind of alluded to, ancient people didn't think of the world in racial terms. Now, they did think of in different terms, like they thought their own tribe was better than some other tribe, or they thought that their nation was better than their nation. They did definitely. People have always hated the outsider, so to speak. View their own group as superior. But as far as what we call race, where it's associated primarily with skin color and secondarily a few other physical traits, that's completely a modern invention, or at least that's the story that we are told, that it did not exist before the European slave trade. We may see that it in fact was previously invented in another society. This comes from an article called Historical Foundations of Race that was published by the Smithsonian. They say that the concept of race as we understand today evolved alongside the formation of the United States and was deeply connected with the evolution of two other terms, white and slave. In the first decades of the 1600s, Africans were captured and brought to the American colonies and served as enslaved labor, but it was only one of many sources of labor initially. And enslavement was not an automatic condition. It wasn't based on how you looked, and it wasn't necessarily permanent. That even people who had been captured from Africa and put in enslavement, they didn't necessarily live their whole life that way, let alone that their descendants were also in slavery. So in these early days of the colonies that would become the United States, it was a fluid situation. It wasn't like what we imagine American slavery to be, or what it came to be. So by the end of the 1600s, the increase or the demand for labor and land to get wealthy was increasing. And the previous labor, which was a good portion of it, was based on indentured servitude, or Europeans who agreed to work for someone in a slave-like situation for a period of time in exchange for the money required to come to the States. That became less viable. As there was more demand for labor, they needed more and more sources of labor, and there just wasn't enough Europeans wanting to come here anymore. So the stakes of bringing slaves in from Africa were on the rise. And to justify this behavior, they began to create laws and create social norms that linked people of African descent with slavery, with perpetual labor. And the social distinctions stopped being primarily based on economics, but rather based on appearance and place of origin. Oops, I accidentally went 2 slides at once there. Oh, never mind. I guess I did it. We're often told that Christianity is the cause of slavery, or that it justified slavery. And we have the Encyclopedia Britannica here giving the standard line that Christianity provided an early rationalization for the permanent enslavement of Africans because they were seen as heathens and slaves in their own land. Now, of course, Britannica doesn't quote a Bible verse because they can't. Were there Christians that held this attitude? No doubt. But ironically, Britannica is right that Christianity did lead to the rise of this race-based society, but for the exact opposite reason they propose, because Christianity fundamentally opposed the idea of slavery, that it fundamentally opposed the idea that a human being could be mere property and owned by another human being. So in order to justify slavery, in light of the biblical tradition that was at least culturally shared, people had to come up with an excuse. And so they ended up turning to science. As the enlightened sciences were coming about, they looked at science, and science said, hey, there is a difference between the African and the European. So you don't really have to view them as human. You don't really have to give them the same rights. Not because Christianity says you don't have any rights, but because Christianity only says humans have rights. And these people, they're not really humans. So by the early decades of the 18th century, the continent savants and natural philosophers no longer automatically looked to the Bible to explain the story of human species. Intent on finding physical explanations for natural phenomenon, naturalists employed more empirical methods to solve one of the biggest anthropological questions of the day. Why did people of Africa, millions of whom were already toiling in European plantations, look different from white Europeans? And this is from an article that was posted in Time magazine by a gentleman named Andrew Curran. He writes that the dominant anthropological concept that emerged around 1750 was called degeneration. Degeneration theory maintained that there was an original and superior white race, and that this group of humans moved around the globe and mutated in different climates. They were explained as a perversion or a deterioration of the higher archetype. Medical practitioners stepped in to flesh out that vague narrative, creating the basis for the idea of what we call race. Anatomists in particular dissected the bodies of supposedly degenerated Africans, and numerous now shocking articles on the supposed damage of living in a tropical climate. Black brains, black bile, black sperm, and even race-specific black lice. By 1850, Samuel Cartwright went even further, identifying 2 specific diseases that he associated with Africans. First was a mental illness he dubbed drapetomania, which caused slaves to run away. So if you're a slave and you run away, it's because you have a disease, not because you don't want to be the property of another human being. It's because you have a disease. Second was dysphagia atypica, a type of lethargy that struck Africans who were not enslaved or overseen by whites. So you see, not only does the black person have a disease that causes them to not want to be in slavery, they also have a disease that causes them to be lazy. So you have to enslave them, you see. You have to enslave the black people for their own benefit. It's not coming from Christianity. This is coming from what at the time would have been considered highly reputable and respected science and medicine. So some naturalists took this even further, proposing that Africans actually formed a different species entirely. And of course, once a scientist or naturalist proposes that Africans are a different species, hey, we now have a perfectly great justification for our slavery, and that's exactly what the politicians did.
And we still have people that pump this crap today, you know. Kind of.
So I just wanted to give that background. Obviously, that's not the focus of today. We're not talking about how atheistic science led to racism. But I wanted to have that background in place because the narrative isn't just that Islam is against racism. It's that Christianity is for it. And when we look at actual history, these ideas were developed to counter what the Christians were doing and saying that slavery is wrong and opposing slavery. Now, did every individual Christian oppose slavery? Of course not. You know, Christians are fallen, sinful beings as well. But it was only people of faith that were arguing against slavery. So we now come...
I was just going to say, I'm just saying that's a point that Christians need to underline, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's one thing to say Islam is racist, but it's quite another to say, and Christianity is not. That's much more helpful. You know, it's kind of like the Muslims who come in and they're like, X, Y, and Z in Christianity is wrong. It's like, okay, but do you have any reason to believe in Islam? Because
exactly.
Just saying that Islam's wrong doesn't mean Christianity's true.
Yeah.
So I titled this slide, Islam Invents Stuff. Perhaps you remember the 1001 Inventions Propaganda Tour, where this group of Muslims, well, I'm glad you don't, but basically the gist was this group of Muslims, they put together this presentation and they managed to get into some museums and set up where they basically presented it such that it appeared that Islam was responsible for all the inventions that Europeans or Americans love.
This is why it's so important to know history, people. Sorry, Thaddeus.
Yeah. So because if you don't
know your own history, other people are just going to come along and tell your history for you, and this is a perfect example of that. Sorry, Thaddeus, go on.
Yeah, so they would take some Muslim thinker, primarily from the golden age of Islam, those couple of centuries where they were mixing all the ideas from India to Spain together and creating some things that were kind of new and made some minor contributions to what would eventually develop into the Enlightenment. And we're like saying that's the only thing that matters. So like Muslims invented mathematics. Muslims invented cameras. Muslims invented medicine. And it's like, okay, you have one guy who arguably made one minor contribution, and then you have all the Europeans who eventually came along and did the other 99.99%, and somehow Islam gets all the credit. But with this idea in mind, you know, taking this connection to the past and looking at one individual and giving them credit for everything that happens, and maybe we can say that Islam is the inventor of racism. They get full credit for this because they were there before the Europeans were.
Go on, you're going to have to make a good case now.
I know. So we'll start with the canonical, or at least semi-canonical sources, the Quran, Btbsoco, and the Hadith. But starting with the Quran, of course, because it comes first chronologically. Muslims will tell us it's the most important source. I might debate that, but they'll at least tell us it's the most important source for Islam. So much like the Bible, the Quran really doesn't say that much about race. which is probably because the concept of race hadn't really been invented yet. So there's nothing, the eternal word of Allah that speaks for all people seems to only know about the 7th century, and at that time, race wasn't a thing, so it doesn't really say a lot about it. Muslims will point us to Surah 30, verse 22, and a couple other verses that say basically the same thing. And of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your language and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs for those of knowledge. And this verse is supposed to prove that Islam can't possibly be racist. Before I give my thoughts, anything you want to say about that verse?
Well, I mean, it's kind of like it doesn't say what those signs are. It just says that your languages and your colors indeed that are signs for those of knowledge. But it doesn't say whether they're good potentates. It doesn't ascribe to them any particular value. It doesn't say that they're equal. It simply says that they are a sign, and that's it. So it could be that if you're one color, that's a sign that you're going to hell. And if you're another color, that's a sign you're going to heaven. Because I know the literature like you do. And so, yeah, so that, it's quite a neutral statement. It just says that your colors are a sign. That's all.
And I agree. The Quran loves language like this, where it just points out obvious things and calls them signs of Allah. Whether it's something in nature, something in human society, it just points to it, and it always says it's a sign of Allah. So all it's really saying is that languages and colors exist. That's all it's really saying.
Yeah, it's like the sun, the moon, and the stars. You can see them; they're signs, and it's like, okay, thanks.
Exactly.
No miracles there.
So even though I don't think that the Quran by itself is necessarily racist, it does have passages that can be used to justify racism. For example, Surah 3, 106. On the day, which is the day of judgment, faces will turn white and faces will turn black. As for those whose faces turn black, it will be said to them, did you disbelieve after your belief? Then taste the punishment for which you used to reject. But as for those whose faces will turn white, they'll be within the mercy of Allah. They'll abide therein eternally. So, knowing nothing about Islam, we might see this as metaphorical, right? We might say that this is a metaphor, that it's really using black and white as metaphors for good and evil. However, when we dig into the sources, they're going to take it literally. And even if it is intended to be a metaphor, this is supposed to be the all-knowing God speaking here. Surely he would have known that people could misinterpret this. And if he meant good and evil, he could have just said good and evil. Or if he meant that their faces will be happy and gloomy, as Yasser Qadi claims that this is supposed to mean. I did a video specifically on this verse looking at Yasser Qadi's claims and comparing it to the Islamic sources, which source after source after source, they take it literally. And they say, they don't all take it racist in a racist way. Some just say that it's so that you can be recognized, right? So that there's a distinct physical characteristic that shows whether you're going to paradise or whether you're going to hell. On the because the day of judgment's arrived, you get this visible sign, and then you get divided up. So they don't all necessarily take it as racist, but they all take it as literally. And the all-knowing God should have known that this would be used to justify racism in later texts and chosen better words.
And, well, I mean, also the fact that it is blatantly saying quite clearly that everyone who's going into heaven is going to be white and everyone who's going to hell is going to be black. So I'm a dirty kuffar, so I'm going to end up looking like a black man in hellfire. And Dawood, who is a convert to Islam, and Zakia Laya from who people who know Speakers Corner will know those names. They're both black guys. According to this verse, they're going to be white like me, or maybe even whiter, to go into heaven. And I know, one might want to ask the question: why does Allah feel the need to be surrounded by white folk?
Yeah, good
It's a fair
question. Good
question.
question. I think so. And I don't have an answer for that, but I
Maybe
will.
go on.
So I'm going to look at Bernard Lewis's work, Race and Slavery in the Middle East, several times. And this was his conclusion on the Quran. He says the evidence of the Quran on the lack of racial prejudice in pre-Islamic and early Islamic times is borne out by such fully authenticated fragments of contemporary literature that survive. And we'll look at some of the actual literature later on. We do not, however, find any clear indication that this, and he means differences between cultures, were felt in racial terms or went beyond the normal feeling of distinctiveness which all human groups have themselves in relation to others. So what he's saying is that before Islam, there wasn't racial divides in society. There was, cultural differences, but they weren't felt in these racial terms. And we'll look at some of that evidence of that in a minute.
Yeah,
But
there
we'll
were black
start with.
emperors. No, sorry, I was just going to say there were black emperors of Rome. There were, black abbots of monasteries in England. There were Arab emperors of Rome. It's so yeah. Like before Islam, there wasn't what we would call racism in the same way that we might think of it today.
Exactly. So we're going to start off a couple passages from Ibn Ishaq. I have two poems that are supposed to be set in the days leading up to the calling of Muhammad. So in theory, they're speaking about pre-Islamic Arabia. They probably more accurately reflect the ideas of Ibn Ishaq's own time, nearly 200 years after the death of Muhammad. But they do predate, at least they predate the canonical Hadith collections. So I thought it would be beneficial to look at this first. And in these two poems, the historical background is that southern Arabia is under the control of Ethiopia, so that there are quite a few Africans living in what would now be Yemen and southern Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot of dark-skinned people in the southern parts of the Arabian Peninsula. And we have, remember, this is supposed to be before the calling of Muhammad. It's supposed to be the events that led up to calling him. And this poet here is talking about a ruler in the north, Al-Asad ibn Mafsud, who he wants to be humiliated. He is calling upon God to humiliate this ruler because of what he's done. And what he did was that, I won't read the whole text in general on these things, I'll just kind of allude to them, but I'll read a couple lines. He shut them in when they should be pasturing freely, his own men, and delivered them to the black barbarians. Withdraw from him thine aid, O Lord. So the black barbarians being described here are presumably the Africans living in southern Arabia at the time. And so you can kind of see the terms that they're thinking of these people in. Again, reflecting more the time of Ibn Ishaq rather than the time that he puts the words in to refer to. Similarly, a poem from another person who is saying that he wants to get vengeance on a particular person, Ibn Du Yazen, and he's talking about Wariz, who's coming from the north, bringing the Persians with him, and he's describing his armies as being very noble and great, and he says that they're lions who train their cubs in the jungle. And then when describing the group that he wants them to be triumph over, he says, you sent lions against black dogs, their fugitives are scattered all over the earth. So we have a northern army coming against the Africans living in the southern part of the peninsula, and they are noble lions, and the enemies are black dogs. So again,
I was just going to say, I'm sure you're going to get into it, but the idea of seeing black as a negative is a motif that runs right through Islamic literature. The negativity, the connection between black and a negative. I hope you get some of my favourites in, and I hope see
Oh
if they
yeah,
make it into
I
your
got a
presentation.
whole bunch. I
Okay,
got a whole bunch of sources.
I'll shut
So
up.
we'll
Keep
get to
going.
those. But I wanted to start with Ibn Ishaq because, from my perspective, and a Muslim can't hold this perspective, but from my perspective, the Hadith are, very late. They probably they probably reflect some degree of truth, but they're largely fictionalized, and they reflect more the ideas of their own society projected back onto Muhammad. So I'm actually giving Muhammad the benefit of the doubt and saying maybe the historical figure didn't actually say all of these horrible things that we'll look at in a minute. But the society that actually developed Islam, because Islam as we know it really mostly developed starting in the 9th century rather than the
Yeah.
7th century when Muhammad supposedly lived. They're saying these things and they're attributing to Muhammad. And these are Sahih Hadith. So the Muslim doesn't have that option. They can't say that these aren't authentic, these aren't his real words, or they're outside of Islam. And no look at Ibn Ishaq would be complete without looking at this passage. I have heard that it was said of him that the apostle said, whoever wants to see Satan, let him take a look at Nabtal ibn al-Harith. He was a sturdy black man with long flowing hair, inflamed eyes, and dark, ruddy cheeks. He used to come and talk with the prophet and listen to him, and he would carry what he said to the hypocrites. Nabtal said, Muhammad is all ears. If anyone tells him something, he believes it. Allah sent down concerning him to those who annoy the prophet and say he is all ears. Say, good ears for you. For those who annoy the apostle, there is a painful punishment. So this does seem like it was probably at least a mostly historical event. Let's give credit and say that it was Muhammad's problem wasn't really with all black people. It was with this specific black man. Well, that's still a massive problem because he
That's an
chooses to
incredible
describe.
That's an incredibly charitable interpretation.
Well, I'm giving the best option here, right? This is the best possible option that he has a problem
Yeah.
with this specific man. And then he describes him as Satan. Okay, that's fine. But then he says, if you want to see Satan, look at him. And then he goes on to describe what he looks like. So any later Muslim reading this will say, what does Satan look like? Oh, he looks like a sturdy black man with long flowing hair, inflamed eyes, and dark ruddy cheeks. And what are they going to think when they see a black man who matches that description? They're going to think that guy is possibly serving Satan. He's possibly connected to him. Maybe he's a demon, maybe he's just worshiping Satan, but there's definitely something wrong with him because he looks like Satan.
I hope have you got an example of someone doing that?
Not as well, the
Because
general idea, sure, but not
I,
like
I,
someone saying those exact words.
I think I think it's it's this association between black and negative, you know.
Yeah,
And
we're going to see that theme over and
yeah,
over. So, lest we think that this is just in Ibn Ishaq and the Muslim can get around it by saying they don't believe in Ibn Ishaq anymore, which in itself is quite ironic since it was originally written as state propaganda to get a single unified biography of Muhammad that everyone could believe in because there was many different ideas floating around. They now want to reject it because they don't like what it has to say anymore. They've changed their religion yet again. But even if they want to deny that, they can't get around this idea that Satan is associated with black people. Because this is from a Sahih Hadith here. Narrated Aisha that the Messenger of Allah was sitting and we heard a scream of the voices of children. So the Messenger of Allah rose, and it was an Ethiopian woman prancing around while her children played around her. So he said, O Aisha, come and see. So I came and put my chin upon the shoulder of the Messenger of Allah, and I began to watch her from between his shoulder and his head. And he said to me, Have you had enough? Have you had enough? She said. So I kept saying no, to see my status with him. Then Umar appeared. She said, So they dispersed. So the Messenger of Allah said, Indeed, I see Shaitan among the men, and jinn have run from Umar.
oh wow.
So there's this Ethiopian woman. She's playing with her children, basically. Aisha and Muhammad are kind of standing in the shadows somewhere they're not seen, kind of implied that they think there's something humorous going on here, or that there's something odd. They're looking at it kind of like, you know, oh, this is interesting. Watching this creature dance about, and then Umar shows up for, you know, whatever reason. He just walked into the scene, and the woman leaves, probably because she didn't like Umar. And Muhammad says that Satan is running away from Umar. So he's saying that this Ethiopian woman who was just playing with her children is Satan.
I mean, it's a pretty for people who believe in Satan. That's a pretty strong statement. And ironically, that is actually pretty much an example of the very thing I said. I hope you have you got an example of someone doing that, and this is pretty much it. So that's pretty harsh. You know, if someone who believes in the devil calls you the devil, that there's no way that that can be interpreted as a compliment. You know,
Indeed, indeed.
so and no one can accuse Muhammad of not believing in Shaitan.
So next up, I have that Muhammad was not black. So don't get confused. We definitely know that Muhammad wasn't black. And there's lots of hadith along these lines. I just picked 4. You could probably, you know, put 20 or more hadith describing the white body parts of Muhammad. I think that 4 is sufficient to demonstrate it, though.
Mm-hmm.
Who among you is Muhammad, the messenger of Allah, sitting, leaning upon something among them? We said to them, this white man who is leaning. So Muhammad's white. Allah's messenger had a white complexion. The Prophet raised his hand so we could see the extent of the whiteness of his armpits. And my personal favorite, that Muhammad is giving the call to prayer at dark, and you know he's turning one direction, turning the other, and the implication is that his cheeks are so white you can see them in the dark. And like I said, there are many more like this. But let's make no mistake, you cannot call Muhammad black, because if you do, you should be killed. Now, Bob, why would you be killed for calling Muhammad black?
Yeah, because it would be an insult to call. If you insult the Prophet, you should be killed. And we've seen countless examples of people who have insulted Muhammad and then suffered the ire of the Muslim community. And just as an anecdote to the same point, Thaddeus, I have on my channel of a debate that I had with a Muslim where a Muslim said Muhammad was black, and another Muslim got angry with him for saying Muhammad was black. He got angry with him, and they ended up arguing amongst themselves about that. And you can find that video on my channel. So yeah, people who insult the Prophet should be killed. And if you call him black, well, clearly black must be an insult. Or to call Muhammad black must be an insult. What's wrong with calling him black?
Yeah, exactly. You know, Muslims will sometimes say, you know, why is Jesus a white man? And well, I'll say, well, he's not. The reason he's depicted as being white in art is because Europeans in the time the art was being produced, they drew Jesus as what they knew. You know, they drew him looking like someone from their own society. But you can see the same thing of people in Asia drawing Jesus with Asiatic features. You can find people in Africa drawing Jesus as black. And no Christian goes around and says, those are inappropriate. Well, I shouldn't say no, but, you know, maybe an isolated Christian here and there does. But it's certainly not a position of Christianity that there's something wrong with those images.
It's commonly accepted to venerate images of our Lord, regardless of what ethnicity he's presented in. I've been to Japan. I have honored our Lord looking Japanese. I have, you know, images of our Lord looking Japanese. You know, it's a silly kind of argument. And the irony is they say, you know, like they say, some Muslims will even say you make Jesus into a white man, like if that's some kind of insult. But the hadiths literally say Muhammad was white. Literally say Muhammad was white. Anyway, go on.
Yep. So moving on. So we have the black stone. Of course, the black stone takes away sins. But more than that, it was when it descended from paradise. So when it came from heaven, It was more white than milk, and it was blackened by the sins of the children of Adam. I say, why did I put this in? Well, it's not hard for a person to look at the stone and say it's turned black because of sin. I wonder if that person with dark skin has also turned black because of their sin. And we definitely see this in Islamic literature, where devout Muslims are said to look at their face to make sure it's not turning black, because they're afraid that they might be sinning without their knowledge and their skin's starting to turn black.
Yeah. Again, yeah, go
on. Next up, we have Adam. So we have two hadiths. I put one of them on the screen, but the reference to the other one is there as well, that say that God created people out of Adam, that he struck Adam's soldiers and divided the people into two groups. The first group is the black offspring, who are like charcoal, and the second group is the white offspring, who are like ants. And he says to the white offspring, to paradise, and I do not care. And he says to the black offspring, to hell, and I do not care. At least in the opinion of this hadith, I find it really hard to get around with the implication that black people are created as charcoal for the fire.
I mean, you would just have to put similar words into the mouths of a Nazi, and everyone would naturally condemn it as racist. If a white Christian was to preach a message like that from the pulpit, he would be condemned for being a racist. So this is an Islamic source teaching the same thing, and to try and say, I'd like to see how they would say, it's they can't use the argument like they do with Aisha. Oh, everyone was doing it back in the past. They can't use that argument. So the only way that they can get around it is to say that it was all metaphor. But I mean, the choice of metaphor is pretty poor. If you're just reading that, it's quite clear it's talking about white people and black people. It's talking about pale people and darker people, with a very clear destination.
Yeah, again, they will, of course, try to argue that this isn't describing skin color, that it's just metaphor. But even, one, I don't find this remotely credible when you're comparing it to charcoal and going to hellfire. But two, even if it is a metaphor, why is your God choosing the two terms that are associated with skin color for his metaphor? I mean, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now we have some physical descriptions of people from Muhammad's mouth, or at least attributed to Muhammad. We, of course, have this favorite saying of listen and obey, even if implied to your chief, even if an Ethiopian whose head is like a raisin were made your chief. There are similar hadiths that aren't quoted as often. My friend, meaning the Prophet, advised me to listen to the man in the position of authority and obey, even if he were a slave, maimed and disabled. And one more, obey whoever is put in authority over you, even if he is a cropped-nosed Ethiopian slave. So nominally, this is actually a hadith that's kind of talking about equality in a sense. Like, you should obey your ruler, you should respect your ruler no matter what. But it only works if there is something wrong with the example provided. Like, the idea is that he's providing the most absurd example possible. Like, even if your chief was an Ethiopian with a head that looked like a raisin, you'd still have to obey him. Which only makes sense if there's something wrong with an Ethiopian to begin with.
Let me try to give it a more modern, give a modern frame so that people can understand how that culturally is being used. Obey your leader even if they're a convicted paedophile. You see, that statement, obey your leader even if, giving the example of a negative, is designed to assert that obeying the leader is the most important thing, but you can only understand the importance of it if in the framework of your culture, being a black Ethiopian whose head is like a raisin is seen as derogatory or something to be mocked or something bad. Or being an Ethiopian slave is seen to be something bad. In the same way, if I said to you, obey your leader, even if he is a convicted paedophile, immediately everyone's heckles on the back of the neck rises. Immediately their brain starts to fire. But they're a convicted paedophile. Well, now it's even if they're a black Ethiopian with a head like a raisin. So you can see that that's the framework that's being used in. Sorry, Thaddeus, go on.
Yeah, like, exactly. It's using this racist attitude to emphasize how important obedience is.
It's a backdrop of racism.
Yep, exactly. It's something that's just accepted by the people and they understand the reference. You put that very well. And then I have this other hadith that is similar in that it's a description of the physical deformities of a black man, or the supposed physical deformities. The most hateful among creation of Allah is one black man, among them a specific tribe. One of his hands is like that of a teat of a goat or the nipple of the breast. And then it describes what happens when the Muslims conquered this tribe. They killed everyone, but they kept searching and searching until they finally found the body of the black man that was described as the most hateful of all of creation.
It just seems that the constant descriptions of black people is a theme in this literature, and it seems to be negative every single time. And well, I mean, it is negative in these presentations, but it's the association of their physical features, their blackness. Like, he could have just said his name and then described his features, if people knew him. And it's that constant, like, describing the devil in terms of a black man, describing the Ethiopian woman in terms of the devil, describing the worst possible kind of leader that you should still obey because he's an Ethiopian with a black physical features, which I don't agree, by the way. I don't think that is a fair description, but that's what he's going for. And here we go again. So you've got clearly the writers of a lot of Muslim literature had a derogatory views of black folk.
Exactly. So continuing on, and in fairness, this is not a canonical hadith, but it conveys the attitude of all of the hadith kind of really well. Words are put in the mouth of an Ethiopian who comes to Muhammad and says, "You Arabs excel us in all, in build, in color, and in possession of the Prophet. If I believe, will I be with you in paradise?" And Muhammad replies, "Yes. And in paradise, the whiteness of the Ethiopian will be seen over a stretch of 1,000 years."
Wow.
So he doesn't say to him, what do you mean that Arabs are better than you? What do you mean that I am of a better color than you? He acknowledges all that. And then he says, guess what? You get to be white like me in paradise. You get to no longer be inferior. You're inferior now, but because you're faithful to me, you'll get to be in paradise and you'll get to be transformed into a white person.
Dude, I mean, like, it's just, because in our last conversation, we discussed about how Muslims have changed which hadiths and stories they believe are reliable based upon the polemics that they've received and criticisms. Like we see it at the moment, they're trying to take away the hadiths that demonstrate that Muhammad was attracted to children, and they're trying to knock them out of the Sahih collection. And I just wonder at what point that was described as not being there. But even the fact that it was ever written, even the fact that it should still be included, even if it's considered daif, like, it's quite a statement. It is quite a statement. And I think I suspect I'll see what your answer is. Are you going to come on to why you think this kind of racialism is inside Islamic sources?
Yeah.
Because I have my own theory, and I'll discuss it later.
A couple more, and then we're going to look at why this might have developed.
Okay.
So before we conclude this, we need to look at the fact that a black person is seen as a bad omen or a curse. So Muhammad said, I saw, and then the translator added in a dream, but quite literally it just says, I saw a black woman with unkempt hair. So maybe it was a dream. Maybe he literally just saw a black woman walking down the street. Going out of Medina and settling in Mahaya, I interpreted that as, and then the translator added symbol of an epidemic. He actually just says, I interpret that as epidemic of Medina being transferred to Mahaya. So Muhammad sees a black woman or dreams of a black woman, and this is signs of a plague, that black people are equivalent to disease or a sign of disease. He also says that he's describing the destruction of the Kaaba, a future event, and he said that he was looking at the person who will do it. It's a black person with thin legs, plucking the stones of the Kaaba one after another. And finally, this hadith is quite long, so I just summarized it here. The gist of it is that a man and his wife are fighting. They're cursing one another, and then they go to Muhammad for resolution of the argument. And the husband swears 4 times that he's telling the truth, and then he invokes the curse of Allah on himself if he's lying. And then the wife wants to do the same thing, and Muhammad says, do not do that. She didn't listen to him, and she did so anyway, invoking a curse. And then after they leave, Muhammad says, perhaps she will give birth to a black child with curly hair. So this woman, who is presumably an Arab, she's going to be, if she invoked a curse, and now she's going to give birth to a black child with curly hair. Giving an Arab giving birth to a black child would be a clear sign of a curse, according to Muhammad.
I mean, that's clearly working from within a racial framework, a racist framework, and a racist culture that looks down on black people. That's very clear, and there's no way you can get around that. Like, I mean, even the interpreters haven't tried to write that off as a dream. The translators, the scholars haven't tried to dull it down like they do in Bukhari 7040. Yeah, I mean, that's quite shocking. And again, if ever you're in doubt, if that's in doubt, just if you're a black Muslim and you're watching this and you think you're trying to make excuses for this in your head, just put those words or words of the same meaning but rephrased by a white Christian pastor and tell me whether you would call it racist. If you can imagine a white Christian pastor saying that and you wouldn't be offended, then fine. But if a white Christian pastor was to say something remotely the same to that and you would be offended, then you're admitting, and quite rightly an intelligent person would, that Muhammad is working from a racist mindset there. Go on.
So before we conclude, we do have to go to the one and only explanation Muslims ever offer. And they say, all those things I can just ignore, because in Muhammad's farewell sermon, he supposedly said these words. We'll get to whether he actually said these words in his farewell sermon in a second. But for the time being, I'm going to read them, and then I'm going to ask the question whether they actually overwrite all the other hadith we've read today. All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. Learn that every Muslim is a brother of every Muslim, and that the Muslims constitute one brother. Nothing shall be legitimate to a Muslim that belongs to a fellow Muslim unless it is given freely and willingly. And, perfectly nice words, but do they actually rule out the possibility of superiority of the white man over the black man?
Are you asking?
Sorry, that was a question for you.
I mean, at face value, given our culture, that's a very powerful it seems like a very powerful anti-racial statement. But if you examine it, I'm trying to examine it closer whilst talking. Yeah, a white has no superiority over black. Black has any superiority over white except by piety and good action. Well, I mean, it says except by piety and good action, and the point is that if the Quran is saying that, you know, black people are going to hell, white people are going to heaven, then that would imply that the whiter people will do the greater piety and good action. So it doesn't from a literary point of view necessarily have to contradict everything that came before. I mean, that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I would agree that one possibility is Muhammad, assuming he said this, and we'll ask that question in a second, but assuming he said this, one possibility is he just contradicted himself. He said different things at different times. I don't think a Muslim's going to want to go to that, though. So then the other possibility is there's a way to make both of the hadith that we already looked at and this statement true, in which case you would first of all, it's only talking about Muslims. Non-Muslims aren't involved at all in this sermon. And then among Muslims, you could just say that there is superiority of the white Muslim or the Arab Muslim, and it correlates with their skin color because of their piety. So it's not because of their skin color, but it correlates with it, such that the best, most pious Muslims are the lightest skinned, and in fact, we'll probably see that a little bit later. That's how Muslims often thought about this. But here's the kicker: it's not. You'll find it on thousands, millions of Muslim websites, all saying that this is from Muhammad's last sermon. It's not. And the first example of that claim is from a 1987 book.
Really?
By a fellow named S.F.H. Fawzi, writing in India. He purported to be writing the final sayings or the sayings of Muhammad, but if you read the fine print, he says that he took stuff from a variety of different sources and combined it in a way that he imagined it took place.
Oh my gosh!
Now, across the world, Muslims will say that this is from Muhammad's farewell sermon. It's not. It's actually from a hadith found in Musnad Ahmad, which is not a canonical hadith collection. It's a secondary hadith collection considered of minimal importance. And this author, this modern author, liked those words, so he added them to the farewell sermon. If you read the two actual historical accounts of the farewell sermon in Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari, they have the words that this individual has, which are about waging war on non-Muslims and so on and so forth. And then he puts this chunk in the middle, and then the words that the other two sources have afterwards come after this in this version of it. So it's completely modern fabrication.
So to be clear, unless your next slide has the original, how it reads in these two sources, are you telling me that really it should be read like this? All mankind is from... Go on. Have you got it in your next slide?
Yes, I don't have it on the slide, but basically, so this whole passage, everything that I read on this, everything on the screen here is added. None of this is part of the last sermon. Last sermon is basically
the whole paragraph there. Total fiction.
Yep. It it's attributed to Muhammad in a non-canonical Hadith collection. He could have said it at any time. It has nothing to do with the farewell sermon. He could have said this first and then later contradicted it. He could have said it when he was having a good day. Or, as Muslims will normally tell us, you can't trust Hadith that aren't Sahih, so we can't trust it at all, right? It's not part of the canonical collections. It's in a secondary collection. We can't trust it at all.
He could have said it one lazy Tuesday afternoon after lunch in the middle of his prophethood.
Yep.
Yeah.
He was having a good day and said something nice.
Yeah, I also think we've got to remember that what we are seeing is the reinvention of Hadith literature. We all need to be conscious of this, is that this Hadith is becoming Sahih amongst Muslims. Like we're literally witnessing it becoming Sahih amongst Muslims. You know, just like we're seeing the Aisha drop from Sahih to non-Sahih about Aisha's age. You know, we're witnessing that, and it just goes back to that old saying that without lies, Islam dies. You know, that that dawaganda is exactly that. It is dawaganda. It's propaganda. That's quite a find. That is quite a find. I genuinely did not know that. Well done,
or as I like to put it, that Islam is 14 centuries of bid'ah being innovation, which is forbidden in Islam. They've just constantly reinvented their religion over the 14 centuries to change it, to adapt to what they need for polemical purposes of that day.
Yeah.
So I have one more hadith, which I saved to last because it segues well into the non-canonical material. It's still written by Muslims, but it's not canonical material. So 2 black slaves. A slave came and pledged to Muhammad to emigrate, and the Prophet did not realize he was a slave. Then his master came looking for him. The Prophet said, "Sell him to me," and he bought him for 2 black slaves. Then he did not accept the pledge from anyone until he asked, "Is he a slave?" So there's so much in here. One, Muhammad clearly owns slaves if he's buying a slave with other slaves.
Selling a slave, yeah.
Yep. 2, the value of a non-black slave was twice as great, or roughly twice as great, as that of a black slave. Black slaves considered inferior slaves even, which the next slide has historical documentation of the price of slaves. And we'll see that this hadith is actually pretty historically accurate. It was about a 2-to-1 price differential. And then third, Muhammad seems to be putting his own personal wealth ahead of his religion, right? So this is a fellow who came to Muhammad and said, "I want to be a Muslim. I want to follow you." And he said, "Great." But he lost 2 slaves as a result of this. And now, after that, he won't accept anyone's pledge to be a Muslim unless he asks if they're a slave. If they're a slave and it was going to cost him money, he's like, "No, thanks. I don't need you to be a Muslim." Just astonishing that the one true religion for all of humanity comes secondary to Muhammad's material wealth, as near as I can tell.
I could not phrase it any better, and I hope all of you black Muslims like Zakiya, like Dawood, like all of you jailbait pussies who converted inside a prison to save your ass, you know, and have come out now gangsters. Like, I hope you're all looking at this. You know, the reality is that your prophet did not value you. He did not value black people in the same way that he valued fairer-skinned people, and that was shown through his economics. And also, like, all of this corresponds. It's a clear motif. And I have my own reasons as to why I think this occurred, and I hope we'll get into that, Thaddeus. But it's a clear motif that you know, the darker you were, the less valuable you were. The darker you were, the more associated with evil, or at least pictorially, it was associated with evil in that society. And Muhammad, rather than saying that that's wrong, is actually going along with it. There you go,
So
Muhammad
we
Ali. Maybe, and yeah. Oh, dearie me. As someone spoke to the nation
I
of
have
Islam. Sorry, I was just going to say, as someone told this to the nation of Islam. If there's any group that needs to hear this, it's the
they're
Nation
not
of
too
Islam.
right. They're not too big on history. Like they would be
Yeah,
considered heretical by Muslims because they've invented their own history about what Islam was. But definitely information that should be out there. Definitely information that should be known. So the next two slides, I have some confirmation of the inferior status of black people from hard data as opposed to words attributed to Muhammad. And then after that, we'll look at why this probably came about. These couple slides are from Bernard Lewis's work, Race and Slavery in the Middle East. And to be clear, this is not like a Christian apologetic work or something. This is an academic work. He may be a Christian, I don't know. Christianity has nothing to do with the work, though. It's just a historical account of the development of slavery and the development of race in the Middle East. He writes that according to his research, black slaves seem to have cost 200 to 300 dirhams, black eunuchs at least 2 to 3 times as much. And we'll see why an eunuch would be more valuable in a second. Female black slaves were sold at 500 dirhams or so, trained singing girls or other performance at 10 or even 20,000. White slaves, mainly for military purposes, were more expensive. Prices of 300 dirhams are quoted for Turks near the source in Central Asia, but much higher everywhere else. In Baghdad, they fetched 400 or 500 dirhams, while a white slave girl could be sold for 1,000 dinars or more. And I looked up the conversion at the time, that would be 13,000 dirhams. So black male slaves are 200 to 300. White male slaves are 300 to 500. So pretty close to that 2-to-1 ratio from the Hadith. And then the females are way more valuable. Black females are 500 or so on average, and white females can fetch 13,000. The exception to white girls being more valuable is if the black girl is also well trained and she can dance and sing and entertain you. This is the picture of slavery in Islam. There is some forced labor, right? There is a use for the males. But primarily, they're interested in females that will fulfill their sexual desires and entertain them. And you can see that the white slave girl is considered much more attractive and much more valuable than the black slave girl.
An Islamic slave market, folks. Still being practiced today, incidentally.
Indeed, indeed. And then we have a couple of slides on the status of black slaves. Again, from Bernard Lewis, there were occasional references to large groups of slaves, mostly black, employed in agriculture. So he's saying the normal use of a slave was in the household, for entertainment, for sex. There are, however, exceptions where they are put into the same kind of forced hard labor. He says the most unfortunate of all these, those in hard labor, were engaged in agriculture and other manual work and large-scale enterprises, such as, for example, the Zanj slaves used to drain the salt flats of southern Iraq, and blacks employed in the salt mains of the Sahara and gold mines of Nubia. These were herded in large settlements and worked in gangs. Large landowners or crown lands often employed thousands of such slaves, while domestic and commercial slaves were relatively well off. These lived and died in wretchedness. This sounds like the stereotypical picture of a Southern American plantation to me, and it's describing the 9th, 10th, 11th century Muslim lands here being worked by these slaves.
Yeah. And I wonder when Hollywood's going to make their own video, their own movie about the Arabs coming in, stealing black folk and, being taken off as slaves. When are we going to see that movie? And when are we going to see the movie about the abolition movement within Islam? Oh wait, that's when. Never, because they've never had one ever. guys,
Exactly.
it's just like you've got to control the narrative. You've got to control the narrative, and information is your weapon. And the reality is, if you're a black Muslim, and you, especially if you're a black Muslim who became a Muslim because you hated the white church and the white Christianity of the West, where's your principles now, guys? Where are your principles now? Like, are you going to be bouncing out of Islam anytime soon, or are you a total cook?
Yeah, maybe you should convert to Buddhism or something. You don't. I'm sure there
Or
was
just,
slaves.
or even better, Thaddeus, how about they join an African church like the Ethiopian Orthodox Church?
Yeah, there you go.
What side are you on? It's kind
No,
of
I was
like,
just going to say. I mean, if your only reason is because of slavery, then go to a religion that didn't practice it, or at least not against Africans. But you're right,
yeah,
absolutely. You know, the historic Christianity was strongest in northern Africa,
yeah.
and the Ethiopic Church is one of the oldest in the world,
It is
and
as old
it's
as,
always been 100% black run. So,
yep, always been 100% black run. And it is as old as any European church, as well as the church in Alexandria, the Egyptian church, which has sadly been Arabized. You know, the Copts, who are the Egyptians, have lost their native language, they've lost their native culture, and lots of them who are Nubians think that they're Arabs. It's like Islam equals Arabization.
yep. And although I didn't put much in that specifically, the superiority of Arabs continues to this day because
Mm.
when someone converts to Christianity, there's no pressure to change your name. There's no pressure to change the way you dress. When someone converts to Islam, not 100% of the time, but a large percentage of the time, they change their name to an Arabic name. They start dressing like they live in the desert. Everyone wants to be Arab in Islam, and that's because Islam was founded as a system to propagate Arab superiority on the world.
Yeah. And you can test how much you've been Arabized. Like, do you think that Arabic is a superior language? I don't, because I've not been Arabized. But if you do, you have been Arabized. Do you think that God can only hear you if you pray in Arabic? That if you do your salat or your ritual prayer in Arabic, if you do, you've been Arabized. As a Christian, we can pray in any language because we've not been Arabized. Do you think that do you think that the holy city that you have to go and visit is in Arabia? Well, Christians can visit holy cities and holy shrines right throughout the world. You know, Walsingham in England, Rome in Italy, you know, Lalibela in Ethiopia, obviously Jerusalem in the Middle East. You can go and see where the Apostle Thomas was martyred in India. That's a place of pilgrimage over in India. You could go to places in Nagasaki in Japan. You know, is there one in America that you can think of, Thaddeus?
We definitely have some nice historic churches in the
Places of pilgrimage
from
in
the
the US.
early colonies. I wouldn't think of one off the top of my head, but there's definitely such churches in the United
Yeah,
States as
there were.
well that
Yeah,
are places of tourism. I wouldn't necessarily call it pilgrimage, but places of tourism for Christians to go and look at their past.
yeah, and the thing is that the thing is like the enslavement of black people in the Islamic slave markets is still happening today. Why aren't we talking about it? Why are we not talking about it? Everything that black Muslims who sort of vent their hatred towards white Christianity, colonialism, you know, enslavement and portrayals of white superiority, you've got in Islam. You've got Arab colonialism, you've got Arabization, and you've got Arab superiority. It's all there.
Mm-hmm.
So when are you leaving, guys? When are you checking out? Like, why are you so dumb that you are, or is it perhaps that you just hate the white man? That it's not about a principle of I am rejecting this Christianity because it's you know, because it's it's something that's been imposed upon me. Well, if that's your reason, why aren't you rejecting Islam? Like, are you going to be consistent to your arguments? Because your arguments for rejecting Christianity would mean that you have to reject Islam. Now, the reality is that Christianity has always been multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-centered. You know, it's always been multi-centered in a way that Islam has never been, and that is why, you know, you can go to holy places in Africa, you can go to holy places in the Middle East, you can go to holy places in Europe, you can go to holy places in Mexico, in Latin America, you know, on why so much of our Christian spirituality is actually African in origin. Like, you know, many of the great saints and the great teachers of the church were from North Africa. Monasticism, which dominated European Christianity, started in Africa. You know, it was Saint Anthony in Egypt. And so, guys, like, we're not the ones with the problem. You've been brainwashed by Hollywood to think only of European slave trade and European colonialism because of liberal progressive media, and you're totally ignorant about the rest of the facts. And I will now get off my pedestal, Thaddeus, sorry, and I'll let you get back to the presentation.
No worries. Worth saying there. To continue on with what we're looking at, the kind of the social status of slaves, that in the military, there were slaves in the military as well, and this was a major feature of the Ottoman Empire, but it goes back to the start of the conquest, that they would use slaves in their military battles. And these were kind of the best treated of all the slaves. They were kind of the aristocrats of the slaves, if you will. Black slaves were occasionally soldiers, but this was the abnormal thing. Usually the lighter skinned people they captured, they put into slavery in the military. The darker skinned people, males here, in both cases males, the darker skinned males were into forced labor, and females of, you know, whatever skin color, they were used as sex slaves. So one more on the look at culture, and then we'll talk about why race was invented. So looking here at 1001 Nights, not the Disney version, but the actual literary work that hasn't been cleaned up and doesn't paint, or the work that actually paints a picture of what society was like at the time.
What period
in 1001.
What period are we talking about?
Yeah, so I believe that it's written around the 9th century.
9th century. So this is a 9th century Islamic work.
Yeah, so we're talking about 1001 Arabian Nights. I don't recall the exact date it was written off the top of my head, but of course, very famous work here. Not a religious text, right? But what it tells us about society, it tells us in that what's just taken for granted. You know, it's painting pictures, in theory, fictional pictures of fictional people, but it's drawing on what's normal in the society to paint those pictures. So it tells us a lot about what was going on in the time and what was normal in society.
Yeah, like Shakespeare. So black people do.
Yep, exactly. So black people do appear often in the literature, but when they do, they're always in these menial roles. They're porters, they're house servants, they're slaves, they're cooks, bath attendants, and very rarely above that level of society, above this lowest rung of society. Bernard Rose writes, perhaps even more revealing in its way, the story is the good black slave who lived a life of virtue and piety, for which he was rewarded by turning white at the moment of death. Once again, we see the influence of the Quran, which is in theory not racist, saying that good black people will turn white when they die. It happens again and again and again in the literature. Seems that my understanding of the text seems to be the same understanding that early Muslims had, that it's talking about people with dark skin literally getting light skin when they go to paradise.
Do you think Black Lives Matter will call for 1001 Nights to be cancelled?
Maybe.
I'm just pointing. like, I'm not trying to be facetious. You know, I've got people in my life that I love who, you know, like who are black, and it's absolute. You know, the way the very way that the whole issue is filtered, that focuses on some, and you know, that need to be challenged, some abuses of the black community, but ignores others. Like, we've been tearing down statues in the UK because of their connection to slavery um, and colonialism. So when are we going to be cancelling 1001 Nights? Liberal progressives, like, are you going to be consistent, or is it going to get an easy pass because obviously it's your pet project of you know, trying to see, you know, your pet project of Islamophilia?
So King Shah Zaman and King Shah Rayar, who are two of the main characters of the work, are, in Bernard Lewis's words, clearly white supremacists. So a lot of the tales focus around these two individuals who, you know, they're kings, they're regularly away from home, and they're talking to one another about what might be going on back home, and they're constantly afraid that their wives will be having sex with the black slaves. It's not so much, they don't necessarily have a massive problem with their wives cheating on them. It's that they're defiling themselves with black slaves specifically, which, remember when I pointed out that eunuchs, people who've been castrated, have a much higher value in the slave market? Well, this is why, because people were afraid that the black men would have sex with their wives, their daughters, the women in their lives, and would defile them because they are black and their relatives are Arab, of course. So if you remove that possibility, and it is a dangerous process that often led to the death of the slave, that's why it's more, right? As opposed to, you know, just a couple dollars to chop the guy's nuts off. It's more because it was a very dangerous process, and it often led to the death of the person. And that threat's removed once the person, at least in theory, once the person has been castrated. Lewis writes that this resemblance in the 1001 Nights to certain aspects of the old American South is confirmed. That the social picture written by Arabs describing their own society sounds just like the picture of the American South seen in every anti-slavery work, and rightly so. I'm not saying that there's something great about the old American South, but I'm saying that the Arab world had the same thing.
And still
So the next,
does. Sorry, can we
yes,
could just keep reminding everybody, you can still buy and sell black slaves today in the Islamic world, and I'm not going to stop talking about it because it needs to be stopped.
yes,
Sorry, go on.
absolutely. It's said that there are more slaves in the world today than at the time of the American Civil War. Obviously, in terms of absolute number, that's because of population growth, but it still emphasizes how many slaves there are in the world. And slavery is now hidden, it's no longer socially acceptable, but it's still practiced around the world, especially in the form of human trafficking, that is people who are essentially slaves being sold for sex.
Hmm.
And as you said, it's quite prevalent in the Arab world. So we're now going to ask the question of why this came about. And Lewis concludes that it's because of the conquest, and I agree. He writes that during the period immediately following the death of the Prophet in 632 AD, the great Islamic conquest took the faith to vast areas of Asia and Africa. A new situation was created, and many changes can be observed in the literature of the time. The first is the narrowing, specializing, and fixing of color terms applied to human beings. So before the Islamic conquest, people were described as having colors, right? I mean, people can observe color, but they used a wide variety of terms. It was, you know, more the attempt to accurately describe the individual. After the Islamic conquest, there are basically only three words used: black, red, and white. That it's gone from a physical description of a person to being a category, being a race, as we would say today. He writes that these became ethnic and absolute instead of personal and relative. Together with this specialization and fixing of color terms comes a very clear connotation of inferiority attached to darker and more specifically black skin tones. From both the expressions and denunciations of racial prejudice, and I don't know how much of the primary text we'll look at, but we do see one or two texts speaking against racism. But racism has to exist before you can speak against it. So the speaking against it proves that it was prevalent and widespread. Lewis continues, in both general and religious literature, it is clear that a major transformation had taken place. In ancient Arabia, as elsewhere in antiquity, racism in the modern sense of the word was unknown. Yet from the literature, it is clear that a new and sometimes vicious pattern of racial hostility and discrimination had emerged within the Islamic world. So you're capturing new lands, you're coming in contact with people who look different with you, you want to justify your own superiority, and hey, if you can get economic benefit from it as well, all the better. Well, how do you do this? Do you do this by saying that these new peoples you're encountering are the same as you and they're just as equal and they have all the rights you have? Of course not. You say that they are inferior, that God has created them that way, that God divided Adam in between the white people, which of course really means Arabs, and the black people which is of course where the majority of the conquest was taking place, was in Africa. So you have one group of people that is destined to conquer and make the other group subservient. Very quickly, prejudice against people who are not part of your group turns into prejudice based on appearance.
That's an interesting thesis. I can still go for another 30 minutes if you've got more material you want to share and go through.
Yep. We'll just run quickly through some examples of this development. So we've seen the conclusion from Lewis here, and now we can see some of the examples that back that up. I won't go through every single one of them, but I'll just cover a few, unless you want to say something about the development of race first.
Well, I'd rather get through your information first, and then whatever time is left, I'll throw it in.
Okay. Yep, I'll just run through this quickly. If you want to, I'll make sure that I pause for a second or two on each slide, but I won't go through each slide. So if you want to look up the sources later, you can go back and pause the video and get examples. They're all very similar, so I don't need to cover every single one as far as.
So this is now secular literature. This is secular literature.
Right. So we'll now be looking at non-religious literature, starting with some poets that were, in this case, basically contemporary with Muhammad, died in 660. And
were they
going
Muslim?
Forward and what's that?
Were they Muslim?
I don't know their religious beliefs. They were in Arabia.
They may or may not be Muslim, but they'll be talking about that. They'll be indicators of the wider culture.
Right. So some of them I know are explicitly Muslim. Others are just implied because they live in Arabia. I mean, we don't generally know very much about these people. We only know them from their poetry.
Okay.
So there's a possibility they weren't Muslim. Anyway, so we'll start with a contemporary poet named Suaim, or more accurately nicknamed, because that means little black man. We don't actually know his name. Clear indication that being black was more important than his name. It just, it was just the distinguishing characteristic of him is that he is a little black man. He writes, "If my color were pink, women would love me, but the Lord has marred me with blackness. Though I am a slave, my soul is nobly free. Though I am black in color, my character is white. I am covered with a black garment. Under it is a lustrous garment with white skirts." So on the one hand, he's kind of saying that my skin color doesn't matter, right? He's saying that underneath I'm just the same as you. But on the other hand, he's saying that it does matter. He's kind of internalized this distinction between white being good and black being bad. And he's saying, just ignore that black exterior. I'm really white on the inside. And furthermore, if I looked different, women would want me, but they don't because I'm an ugly black person, basically, is what he's saying.
Yeah, that's he's it's definitely a testimony that there was a wider racial culture going off in Arabia at the time of the Prophet, or should I say Muhammad?
Yeah. So this individual here, Ubayd Allah ibn Abi Bakr, managed to rise to the ranks of a governor despite
Mm-hmm.
being the son of a black slave. So you can see that there's still, some rights of black people in this early period. Coins on the screen are a couple coins from his time as governor. However, an Arab poet writes of this individual, the blacks do not earn their pay by good deeds and are not of good repute. The children of a stinking Nubian black, God put no light in their complexions.
Wow.
So we see the Arab, right? So that it's not so prevalent in society that it's impossible for a black person to achieve something, become an important person of society. But you see the attitude of the poet. He's saying that guy got there by misdeeds, and his evidence for this is that he's black, basically, and that Allah has made him that way. There's no light in his skin, therefore I know there's no light in his heart as well. He's an evil person, basically, is what he's saying.
Well, we need to clearly cancel the poetry of Ubayd Allah ibn Abi Bakr. Clearly.
So Nasab ibn Rabad is another black poet. An Arab poet writes of him, I saw Nasab astray among men. His color was that of cattle. You can tell him by his shining blackness, even if he is oppressed. He had the dark face of an oppressor. The black poet responds, if I am jet black, musk too is very dark. There's no medicine for the blackness of my skin. So again, he's saying that you shouldn't judge me based on my dark skin, that there are dark things that are good. But then at the same time, he's also internalized this racism. He's saying that there's no medicine, meaning there's something wrong, right? There's something wrong. I need medicine to get rid of the blackness of my skin because it's a defect. But there is no such medicines. There's nothing I can do about it. So he both counters it and absorbs it at the same time. And this is a black person writing this.
Well, you could interpret that as him as saying, well, I'm going to try and as a way of sort of owning the other, in the same way that the black community owned the N-word to take away its power. I mean, another way you could interpret that is this is him doing a similar equivalent. It's kind of he's owning it, but in a defiant way.
You're right.
Which means that he's pushing back against some kind of wider oppression.
Exactly. Obviously I don't know his attitude, but my point was that he's at least saying that this is how people view him, right? That he has a disease and that's why his skin is black. Jair is one of the most important of all the Arabian poets, and he writes of a black poet that when he saw him wearing a white shirt, it was like a donkey's penis wrapped in papyrus. The black poet responds, though my hair is woolly and my skin black, my hand is open and my honor bright. Again, just showing the prevalence of this racism, even in a society where black people could still be in fairly important roles. A poet is, at the time, this is a position of prestige to an extent, but even the black people in a position of prestige who are not slaves, who probably don't come from a slave background, even they are facing this kind of blatant racism from Arab poets.
And the colorism there as well, like he's totally absorbed the colorism. It's kind of like my honor is bright. It's closer to white than it is to black. So my honor So he's absorbed completely the colorism that you find in the Islamic literature. And I personally suspect there might be a bit of a synergy between synergy. And it will come to my reasons in a second, but definitely the Quran is playing into.
So I'll just run through a couple more of these real quick. This one is a historical account, or purported historical account, about the last Umayyad Caliph who was given the gift of a single black slave, and he tells his secretary to write a sarcastic thank you letter, which reads, "Had you been able to find a smaller number than one in a color worse than black, you would have sent that as a gift." So the worst thing in the world, least number is obviously one. You can't send less than one of something. And there was nothing worse than a black slave. This was the least valuable member of society. So that's why the Caliph used this as an insult.
Wow.
I'll skip over this one, but a couple black poets describing themselves as not having access to love, not having access to society because they're described as ugly. And I want to come to Jaiz of Basra, because this is a very interesting figure. And everything we looked at this point was the 8th century or earlier. Starting in the 9th century, basically the blacks just disappear entirely. There are no more black poets. There are no more blacks writing literature, with the possible exception of Jaiz. I say possible because it's disputed what his ancestry actually was. Some sources say that he was, that his one of his 4 grandparents was black. Other sources depict him as being very dark skinned. Some say he was an Arab with no black ancestry at all. And if you search for this name, you'll see a bunch of different pictures, range of, artistic interpretations. Obviously, they didn't have photographs of him, running from being very dark to very light. But he did write a work that, at least on the surface of it, seems to defend black people. It's called "The Boast of the Blacks Against the Whites," and it's written as a celebration of African culture. However, there's good reason to doubt whether this work is what it appears. You will find Muslims online today celebrating this work and talking about Islam's long history of celebrating black achievement. I'll get into the reasons why it might not be genuine in a second, but even if it is genuine, it still reflects the racism prevalent of society, because he feels the need to defend the Zanj people, which is basically people south of Ethiopia, these lands which had minimal contact with the Muslims. So they were often considered the worst of all people, pure savages, cannibals, all kinds of nasty things. Roughly equivalent to what we would now call sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia and the surrounding lands, or most properly, the Bantu people. Anyway, he feels the need to defend them against weakness of mind, lack of discernment, ignorance of consequences, and there's a charge that the Zanj have less intelligence than that of a woman or a child. However, his defense might not be that genuine, because in his other works, he is a strong defender of Arab superiority and writes quite racist things. And this last one on the list here gives us a hint of why he would have written that work as a satire. The Su'ibiyah, which is a movement against Arab superiority in Islam, they maintain that elegance is prized of all people at all times, even the Zanj, despite their dimness, their boundless stupidity, their obtuseness, their crude perceptions, and their evil dispositions. Despite all those things, they still make long speeches. So he's saying that their argument doesn't work. So their argument is basically, and to be clear, this group isn't primarily Africans. This is primarily other people who are against Arab superiority.
So
their argument...
sorry to jump in, Thaddeus. So, because I often point out Arabization, and what you're saying here is that we have a whole movement of people or peoples that were also pushing back against Arabization in the 9th century.
Yes.
So before Arabization had succeeded, they were people trying to resist Arabization.
Correct. And their argument was basically that they're elegant, well-educated people in our society. They have every right to be treated well. They have every right to the same claim of superior social status as the well-educated Arabs. And then he here explicitly says that, compares their argument to saying that the Zanj are intelligent, which everyone knows they're not, basically is what he's saying, which then makes it seem like that other work may entirely be satire. Like he's writing it in the style of their writing, but rather than, these groups that are on the fringe of society that are almost acceptable, he writes it about the group that no one could possibly view as equal, in that the Zanj, the people of southern Africa, where there's just little actual contact and just rumors about how vile and disgusting these people are. So he's saying that even they you could make that same argument even about them, saying your argument doesn't work, is basically what he's saying.
Wow. That's I think you've established a very clear case. Is there more to come, or is that the last slide?
Let me just jump ahead here, just real quick. So the Zanj Rebellion is probably a defining characteristic in the development. We read about the slaves in southern Arabia working the salt mines and other hard labor, and there was this massive rebellion against them during the Abbasid Caliphate. There's this massive uprising during the Abbasid Caliphate. Historians debate how much it was actually a slave revolt and how much it was just people in general that the slaves joined in with. But in Arab thought, it absolutely became associated with the slaves, with black people, and thus why it's called the Zanj Rebellion. And this is probably a very important step in the complete ostracization of black people. Remember, I said in the 8th century, there was still plenty of connection between, it was, while they were socially inferior, there were still opportunities for black people in Arab society. In the 9th century, that disappears, and that's also when the Zanj Rebellion took place. And let me just give one or two examples of the geographers. So, people in theory writing history, in theory writing about objectively. I think this is probably a good example here from Ibn al-Fariq, who says that Arabs are the best people and that their skin complexion is perfect. And he says that they do not come out something between blonde and buff and blanched colors, such as the infants drop from the wombs of the women of the Slav, and others of similar light complexion, nor are they overdone in the womb until they are burned, so that the child comes out with something between black, murky, malarious, stinking, and crinkly-haired, with uneven limbs, deficient minds, and depraved passions, such as the Zanj, the Somali, and other blacks who resemble them. The Iraqis are neither half-baked dough nor burned crust, but between the two. So people who live to the north of the Arabs, who are even lighter-skinned, they're underdone. They didn't fully develop in the womb. And people who live to the south of the Arabs, who are darker skinned, they're burnt. Their complexions are, they spent too much time in the womb. They come out with all kinds of birth defects. They're unintelligent. They're depraved. And this is a historian or a geographer attempting to just describe people the way they were. Obviously, he didn't actually have contact with these people, but he's repeating the norms of a society. He's looking at the world around him and he's saying, we're the best people. We're the people who are properly developed. Other people are either in the womb too long or not long enough. And as a result, their societies are crappy, especially the Zanj and other blacks. They live in these depraved societies with cannibalism, and they don't understand reality. They go naked. They're wild animals. They steal each other's children. They're uncivilized, that they have no notion of natural death because everyone is just killing everyone else. They lack of knowledge and they're deficient of minds. These are geographer after geographer after geographer. They all basically say the same thing. And this is the scientific, enlightened point of view of the era. So wow. I think I'll end it there.
I take it you've still got a lot more slides.
Just a couple more. I can just put them up. So Ibn Sina, who is celebrated as the father of medicine by Arabs, he said that black people are by their nature slaves. Very popular work on imaginative tale of paradise. Once again, showing that people turn white in heaven.
Could you go back and let's go back and don't feel too rushed to blast through.
Oh well, I was just going to leave it there, but you said you wanted to see the slides, so
yeah. So you were black and now you're more dazzlingly white. So that's playing straight into the Quranic. That's playing straight into what the Quran says. So he's interpreting what the Quran says in the same way that I polemically interpret the Quran, and I use that to criticize Islam. You've got a Muslim, who is he, a poet or a geographer? Or
a poet.
Doctor. You've got a Muslim poet who's interpreting the Quran in exactly the same way.
Right. So this is an imaginative tale of heaven. The gist of it is that a new arrival to heaven is kind of traveling around and figuring out what's going on. And he encounters a couple girls, and they're kind of laughing because he doesn't know who they are. He doesn't recognize them. And then they reveal that they were black, right? That they were the black slave that he was familiar with, or the black servant that he was familiar with.
Yeah.
And then the Arab imam, preacher, sheikh, I think is how he's described in the text, says, "There's no God but God. You were black, and now you're more dazzling white than camphor," which is a very white flower that produces a white chemical. And then the girl,
it's like, congratulations, you're white now.
Right.
Well done, so you're white.
So the formerly black girl replies that one mustard seed of light from him, meaning Allah, with all black people mixed would whiten all the blacks. So, you take Allah's whiteness and you give that, and you take just a tiny bit of that and you give it to the black people, and they'll all be white too.
Wow.
So
and that's exactly what the Quran says. It's exactly what the Quran says.
So Allah will share his whiteness with the black people who make it to heaven, and they'll no longer be disgraced by being black, is basically the gist of it.
Which fits in well with the Hadiths, this idea of Adam's shoulders, white for paler people and darker people. Really terrible. And again, like if you don't think that this is racist, just imagine a white preacher saying it from a pulpit. Of course it's racist. Of course it's
yes,
racist.
Exactly. And I'll end with this one here, because this is a rare example of a Muslim saying that racism is wrong. Writing in the 13th, probably writing in the 12th century, since he died in the very early in the 13th century. He says that I've seen a number of outstanding Ethiopians whose heart is breaking because of their black color. So I let them know respect is based on performance of good deeds and not on beautiful forms. So he said, this individual, to his credit, he thinks that black Muslims have the same rights as everyone else. But he's describing Ethiopians, and he's saying that their heart is breaking. They see their black skin, they see what that means in Islam, and they're distraught. They feel like they don't belong. They feel like they can never be a good Muslim, and he's trying to reassure them that that's not the case. Which obviously means that he's fighting against the prevailing attitude of blacks being inferior in Islam.
Yeah. And the thing is, Muslims, when they talk about Christianity and the Latinos and Latin America and what went off there, they always ignore the fact of all the priests and all the Christians that railed against it. They always ignore that bit. And I would like to see how many people were railing against it in the same vein as this guy. railing against all this that you've already talked about. And so, are there many more slides? Have you got more? How many more slides have you got?
I think this is a good one, and I just had two that came after because I put them in chronological order. But I think that this is
okay. So the thing is, like, I mean, for me, part of what I think fed into all of this is the fact that in agricultural societies, in ancient societies, being, you know, slightly plump and pale was an indication that you were rich. In the same way that today, having a suntan, or like in the 1970s and 60s, having a suntan was an indicator that you were rich because you had the money to fly abroad and get a suntan and come back and show everybody, look at my tan, which is why we have people now using fake tan. And I think that in that society, like that this is what played into that. If you were paler, it showed that you were wealthier because you weren't out in the sun. And notice the correlation between these derogatory terms against how black people look and their relation to being overbaked, overcooked. You know, it's got this connection to the sun, and I think that I actually think that played into a lot of the colorism that we see in the Islamic sources. Because, you know, the Arabs weren't shy about wanting to indulge their heavenly fantasies on earth with their harems and palaces and fancy cushions and gardens. And I don't think working in the salt mines of Iraq or the gold mines of Ethiopia fitted well into that vision. And so I think that's why Muhammad is described as white.
I would agree that you know, I don't think that although it's a funny image to say that, you know, Muhammad is as white as snow or you know, white as a piece of paper or whatever. I don't think that the Hadith is actually trying to say that. I think that it's trying to say that, you know, he's reflecting that he has the light of Allah and he's reflecting it on the world, and probably along the lines of what you're saying as well, that, you know, he's this most honored member of society. He doesn't have dark skin. Well, whether he literally does or not, he should be seen as not having dark skin because the kings have light skin because they never go outside, and the royalty, you know, they have light skin because they never go outside, and I think that is probably correct, that is playing into it, that because royalty would be associated with light skin because they don't have exposure to the sun, that would be part of it. And I saw earlier that you put up the line from Song of Solomon where it says, "I'm black, but I'm beautiful." And that's exactly what that's about. Like, you know, this is a common person of Israel. They have been working outdoors. Their skin is dark from being outside all the time. And this is contrast to King Solomon, who obviously is a king, and he is royalty, and his skin is not dark. His skin is light, but it has nothing to do with race. It's about this privilege of wealth, like you said.
And the thing is, like, I'm just pulling up that verse, from Song of Solomon. Bear with us. I am black, but I am beautiful, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me, because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyards I have not kept. So you've got that sense of, if you're working in the sun, you were kind of looked down upon because you were poorer. But in the Song of Solomon, she's saying, I am black, but I'm beautiful. You know,
Mm-hmm.
And then you've also got the description of our Lord. There's that famous scene in that piece of propaganda from Malcolm X. Do you remember the one where he's talking to the preacher and he starts he's saying that, Jesus wasn't white, and he quotes Revelations to demonstrate that, there's a description in the Bible of Jesus that is not white, that he's described as being a man of color, like dark skinned. Do you remember? Do you know that one in Revelations?
I don't know it off the top of my hand, but historically speaking, that was certainly would be true. Jesus was
I'll
definitely
just pull it
out
up.
in the
I'll
sun a
just pull it
lot.
up. Bear with us. Bear with me 1 second. Bear with us. I'll pull it up. In Revelations chapter 1, verses 14 to 15. I don't suppose you got your Bible next to you, have you? Still there, bro?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was unaware you wanted me to pull it
Bear
up.
with us. I'll pull it up. So, in Revelations chapter 1, verses, what did we say? 14 to 15. His head and hair were as white as wool, even as white as snow, and his eyes were like a fiery flame. His feet were like polished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. So, like if you the hadiths describe Muhammad as a white man. The description of the Bible of Jesus Christ is not to be it's not to be taken literally, though there are some people that argue that it would, because obviously Revelations is full of metaphorical imagery. But the most beloved person of the New Testament is described, even if metaphorically, and it obviously leans in towards truth as well, actual fact, but he's described as having dark skin. The most beloved person of the New Testament is described in Revelations as having dark skin. Now, tell me, guys, like you've got a white Muhammad who's selling black slaves, describing black people derogatorily, and his followers go on to believe his book, even to write works of poetry and fiction, that you're going to become white when you go to heaven. And then in the New Testament literature, you have Jesus literally being described. The only description of that references a color of skin describes him as being dark skinned. And Christians were portraying Jesus as black 2,000 years ago and have done ever since. And all the way through Christian history, the Ethiopian church and the Alexandrian church of Egypt have always been African churches led by Africans. Always. When are we going to start talking about the salt mines of Iraq and the gold mines of Ethiopia during the Islamic slave trade? But we all know about the cotton fields of the southern states of America, and we all know about the plantations in the Caribbean. When are we going to start talking about the salt lakes in Iraq and the gold mines of Ethiopia run by the Islamic slave trade? And all the black folk that died. When's that going to appear in Black History Month?
Good question. Good question for sure.
I mean, it's Black History Month. It's not anti-white History Month. Remember that. It's Black History Month, not anti-white History Month. So why can't it appear in Black History Month? Anyway, yeah. I go on. I've got more to say if you're all right to stay on a bit longer.
Yeah. I'm happy to stay on a little longer.
I mean, I think it's worth saying, obviously, that whatever the problems are within Islamic sources, it doesn't necessarily follow, and nor are we trying to suggest that all Muslims are racist. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to work that out. And I do think that there's a bit of blindness in our eyes to the ethnic divisions amongst the Muslim community. Like, you do have Somali mosques, you do have Pakistani mosques that, like, they'll take you to a mosque and they'll talk about, oh, look how multi ethnic it is. And definitely there are mosques like that. There's no doubt about it. Just like there are churches like that. But there are also definitely ethnically based mosques, even in the Western world. You do see that, where groups have divided. And I know, and you can't fool me because I grew up with Muslims, I know that Somalis have often complained about the racism that they've received from other ethnic groups within the Muslim Ummah. That's something my Somali Muslim friends used to tell me. So I know it happened, guys. You're not going to be able to pull the wool over my eyes. A BBC editor, maybe, but not me. Like, but yeah, I do think that also, because Islam is a minority religion with fewer mosques, it is easier for them to cover up the sort of ethnic divisions. But there are problems within the Islamic community along the lines of racism that gets brushed over by the Dawah-Gandhist. And I don't think we should be blind to that at all. And one other final point, which is the whole point about Christianity is that the promises of Israel are given to the Jews. Sorry, not given to, are given to the Gentiles. So the promises of Israel that belong to the Jews are given to the Gentiles. So the very birth of Christianity is about tearing down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile. That dividing wall was the wall that if you crossed it in the temple court, if a Gentile crossed it, they could be killed. And they were warned not to cross the dividing wall. And Christianity is about tearing down that dividing wall. So it's literally about tearing down ethnic divisions. Literally about tearing down ethnic divisions. And that is why Christian churches establish themselves in Syria, in Egypt, in Greece, in Italy, in India, in Persia, and they took on the native culture. They took on the native flavor wherever they planted their foot down. And then there was an aberration in the 1700s and 1800s when missionaries went out and just took England with them or France with them. But that was an aberration. It's not actually reflective of the vast majority of Christian mission throughout the world. That is a pure aberration. So Christianity, I think, clearly demonstrates both at root and in practice, and also in terms of its literature as well, a very clear basis by which different groups and races can find an equal dignity that they have, and unite on that. Go on. Any other?
Yeah. To emphasize your point, I would say that Christianity is radically inclusive, both historically and in the scriptures. Just look at the people that Jesus was talking to. He was talking to people who were outcasts of society. He was talking to women. He was talking to poor people. He was talking to, perhaps most radically of all, he talked to Samaritans. Samaritans, just quick historical background, these are Jewish people of Jewish ancestry who chose to intermarry with Gentiles, which was forbidden. And as a result, they were often seen as even worse than the Gentiles. Like, these are the most hated people in the eyes of an average Israeli living in the first century. Probably, it may be the Romans because, they're directly oppressing them, but it very well may be a Samaritan as well. And Jesus spoke to all these groups. And then, as you said, the the message goes from just as it was always intended, right? And this is just the way it was always intended to be, that Israel would be the light of the world, but the message was for the whole world.
Yeah, for the
It's then
nations.
transferred, right? It's transferred from Israel as a nation being the light of the world to the individual believer being the light. And as a result, Christianity in its historical origins was radically inclusive. You know, it was reaching out to the lowest members of society and telling them that they had value, that they were deeply loved by a God who had created them. And Islam does not have this message. It nowhere has a message that God loves you just the way you are, that he hates your sin, but he loves you because he created you to be a part of his family. And he brings everyone back. And the message of the New Testament is the restoration of God's family. He brings people back into his family. And if we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, who are we to look at one another and say, that person is inferior to me? You know, do I look at my biological siblings and I say that they are inferior or superior to me? Or do I look at them with a loving relationship? Do I look at them as, you know, of the same blood, of the same person as me? And this is the message of Christianity. And this is the way it was practiced historically. Does Christianity have black marks on its history? Have Christians done bad things? Absolutely. And we acknowledge those things. We acknowledge the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. We acknowledge the horrors of American racism in the up into and including the 20th century.
The thing that always gets left out, though, is the fact that those countries, you know, Britain spent money and weapons and lives to end the slave trade. Like,
exactly.
When it decided, oh, we did wrong, we should stop this, it then went on to sacrifice its own soldiers, spend its own money, and destroy its own ships in the fight to suppress slavery everywhere else. The Americans forced the Barbary pirates to stop their piracy and enslavements. You know, so Christians, yes, we did wrong, but the bit that everybody forgets is that we then went on to try and physically stop slavery. The Ottoman Empire only abandoned slavery because the British said, if you don't, our ships will blow the crap out of you. Like, we forced them to stop slavery at gunpoint. And everybody forgets that bit. So when we're having this discussion, can we have a more fuller discussion about the topic? You know,
exactly. Yeah, and I was getting to that yes, we have black marks on our history, but only Christianity in all of world history has fought for equality, and Christianity has won to such an extent that people no longer understand how Christianity has fundamentally changed the world.
Amen.
In the ancient world, no one would have had this idea that other human beings were of intrinsic value. That is, other than the Jewish people, inspired by the scriptures. This is an idea that Judaism, through Christianity, brought upon the world, and we now just take it for granted. You know, whether
Amen.
we're Christian or not, we take that for granted. But the reality of the matter is that when you look at world history, when you look at Islam, when you look at anywhere in the world, you know, in the Americas before Europeans came, in Asia, in Europe before Christianity came to it, anywhere in the world, you see people hating one another, you see people fighting with one another, you see destruction, and you see slavery as an accepted normal part of life. It was only Christianity that fought against slavery, and in fact, Christianity ended slavery twice. You talked about ending modern slavery and imposing its will on the Islamic countries, which did not want to end slavery.
And it's still doing
prior
slavery.
to that, right, yeah. Unofficially, officially they've ended slavery, but unofficially, of course, slavery still goes on. But even prior to that, in the Christian land, slavery had been ended before the transatlantic slave trade reintroduced it. That Christians were going to the slave market, buying people, setting them free, eventually led to the end of slavery because there was no more market for it. No one wanted slaves anymore because Christianity had changed the way the world was.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is that people don't realize that the very reason, and you've put it very well, that the very reason why it's abhorrent to own a slave in the West is because of the Christian conscience, like people like William Wilberforce in the latter period. The only reason why slavery started again in the West is because of Islam and its conquest of Spain and Portugal, who, for over 700 years of Islamic occupation, then normalized slavery again. So people to whom slavery had been renormalized then went on to enslave people again. And people forget that connection as well, you know. Thaddeus, that was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you on. I'd love to have you back at another point
Absolutely.
in the future. Who do you think I should have on next? Who would you suggest that I have on?
Putting me on the spot here, man. Yeah. Well, you know, I'm going to say that you should try to get Mary on.
Mary.
Yep.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. I know who you're talking about. Yeah, please help with that. I would love to have Mary on.
Yep.
I know she's a very eloquent, intelligent, and powerful
speaker.
Because
she blows me away with how much she knows about.
She's a bit of a brain, isn't she?
Yeah. She, no half brain there. Twice
no
the
half
brain,
brains. No half brains.
Me.
I could just put it like Mary B. Muhammad.
She's gone so far as to learn Arabic to be able to better understand the Muslim sources and talk to what they say. And she's actually working on her own translation of the Quranic. I wouldn't suggest that as the topic, but just, how much she knows about this material always blows my mind. And she knows just as much about Christianity too. She's excellent on both ends of the spectrum.
Thaddeus helped put us in touch. Like email her and CC me into it, and let's build that connection. And I'll try and get Mary
do that
on.
right after this.
Right.
And I'll leave it at that.
Then in that case, I will say, let me just grab my prayer book. 1 second.
While he's doing that, we'll just express my appreciation for everyone who joined in today. These are not easy topics to talk about. They are important topics to talk about because when we refuse to talk about racism because we want to be PC and we don't want those difficult conversations, then we allow Islam to spread their propaganda on this measure. So thank you for tuning in today, despite the difficult nature of the material.
Okay. Deus in nomine, save me, O God, for thy name's sake, and avenge me in thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God, and hearken unto the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and tyrants which have not God before their eyes seek after my soul. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil unto mine enemies. Destroy thou them in thy truth. An offering of a free heart will I give thee, and praise thy name, O Lord, because it is so comfortable. For he hath delivered me out of all my troubles, and mine eyes have seen his desire upon mine enemies. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Good night.